Let's break down 4 wide receivers, 4 running backs, a tight end, and a quarterback that I think you guys need to go out and trade for right now before Sunday's action kicks off. All these players are in line for great fantasy performances on Sunday, and I think you guys need to go out and buy low on them right now while you still can. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 4 pick'ems are already live, and if you guys want to claim a free Lamar Jackson over half of a total yard pick'em to use towards Sunday's action, Underdog is giving that free pick'em to every new customer who signs up with promo code THECATCH. And on top of that, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. That's a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's slate, as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash to use on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, let's kick things off with Mike Evans, coming off of his worst fantasy performance on the season so far. 3.7 fantasy points, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 17 receiving yards. Bad day. Pat Surtain had him locked down. Baker Mayfield was barely looking his way. I mean, the game script was there. You know, the Broncos were dominating the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers needed to throw the football. And Mike Evans just ended up not being a big part of this game. But he also had a bad performance against the Lions in week 2, who have been a pretty poor secondary overall on the season and given up plenty of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So we go back to week 1, played the worst secondary in the league and had 23 fantasy points and 2 touchdowns. Well, here in week 4, he's getting one of the worst secondaries in the league, the Philadelphia Eagles, who are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They just came off of a game where they gave up the big touchdown to Chris Olave. He walked away with his best fantasy performance of the season so far. And I don't think Mike Evans is done in his offense whatsoever. I mean, it feels like ages ago when he had that big game against the Commanders, but he's going to get it back together. This is Mike Evans. I know Godwin's having a fantastic season, but Evans is still the wide receiver 1 for the Buccaneers, still has great chemistry with Baker. Even with these past 2 poor performances, he's still averaging double-digit fantasy points so far on the season. Great matchup here at home for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team that's looking for a win, coming off of that beating they took from the Buccaneers. Good competitive game script against the Eagles here. It's a great Eagles team overall, although they've had some struggles and they're going to be a little bit weaker on offense potentially. But at the end of the day, Evans in great line for a big game against this secondary, and overall there should be a positive game script. So I think he's going to have a big week, and I think he's a very easy player to go out and offer some trades for because he's coming off of these 2 really bad performances fantasy wise, but he's going to pop again in week 4, so you need to go buy him low while you still can. All right, let's move along to Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, another player who's been very solid on the season, who's averaging double-digit fantasy points per game, coming off of a bad performance against the Dallas Cowboys. He's sitting as the wide receiver 35 in fantasy football right now, and he does have a bit of a tough matchup against the Bills in week 4. This Bills secondary has been really, really good this year, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. But I think that helps you go out and buy low on him, because I think some fantasy managers looking at this matchup not feeling so great, and you got Flowers coming off of that bad performance in week 3. That could definitely help you get a trade done. But we want to look back to week 3 and kind of realize, while Flowers only had 4 targets compared to 10 in week 1 and 11 in week 2, the game plan against the Cowboys was just to run the football against this Cowboys defense that is the worst in the league right now against the running back position, giving up the most points to the running back position. And not only did they run it the running back, they ran it with Lamar Jackson as well. So Henry and Lamar feasted. And even though it was a good competitive game script as the Cowboys started to come back, Zay Flowers just wasn't necessary in this game. He's going to be more necessary against this Bills defense on Sunday Night Football. And even if he walks away with another poor performance in week 4, I still think that helps you. But he's going to get the Bengals in week 5, the Commanders in week 6, and the Bucs in week 7. better days are definitely ahead for Zay Flowers, who was the focal point essentially of this Ravens offense in the first 2 weeks of the season. He's the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this team, and I think now is the time to go out and try and trade for Zay Flowers and buy him low. All right, next up is Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers, who I will note is dealing with a calf and quad injury at the moment, so keep that in mind. But what's crazy about Jayden Reed is, after the Jordan Love performance, he's had 2 bad performances back-to-back, right? 6.6 fantasy points in week 2, 10.9 in week 3 is fine, good enough, I guess, but still not great. And then, week 1, obviously, he had 33.1 fantasy points. But what's crazy there is he's the wide receiver 6 in fantasy football still. That's what his ceiling is that, 30-plus point performance type. And while it might not be there against this Vikings defense in week 4, I think that helps you once again to go out and buy him low, because fantasy managers are looking at, I don't know if Jordan Love's going to play in week 4 or not. It might be another week of Malik Willis. Hasn't had a high ceiling the past couple weeks. Now he gets the Vikings defense. But after that, he's going to get the Rams, the Cardinals, the Texans, the Jaguars, and the Lions in the next 5 weeks before the Packers hit the bye. And Jordan Love might be ready here in week 4. If not, he's going to be ready in the next couple of weeks. There are some big performances coming up for Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. We're going to see this ceiling absolutely elevated again for Jayden Reed. Now is the time, especially with the injuries popping up. Jordan Love still questionable. A bad matchup in week 4. Now is the time to go buy low on Jayden Reed while you can, because he's absolutely going to pop over the next 5 weeks in fantasy football. All right, last wide receiver I want to talk about, I talked about last week as well, and that's Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. And Addison might not play in week 4. He's still dealing with that ankle injury, almost played in week 3, but he didn't. And I'll just keep it short with Jordan Addison. I just think that the Vikings offense, very good. Their passing attack, very good. And when Addison is back and healthy, he's going to be a big part of this Vikings passing attack. I'm not going to discredit Jalen Naylor, who's been great, and I still think could easily, when Addison is back, still be involved in this Vikings passing attack. But Sam Darnold playing at an MVP type level, and Addison's going to be heavily, targeted. Just don't forget, Addison was a top 25 wide receiver in his rookie season, nearly 1,000 receiving yards, 70 receptions, and 10 receiving touchdowns and 13 yards per catch in his rookie season. So now's the time to go out and try and buy him and stash him, even if he doesn't play week 4. Like, if you're looking at week 4 against the Packers, not great. Week 5 at home against the Jets, not great. Then the Vikings get a week 6 bye week. So I can understand, even if you want to hold out another week or so to trade for Addison, but after that, starting in week 7, the Lions, the Rams, the Colts, the Jaguars, a very solid stretch. After that, the Titans, Bears, Cardinals, Falcons, Bears, Seahawks, Packers, a little bit up and down, but those few weeks there, the Lions, the Rams, the Colts, the Jags, all very solid. Then you look at some of those other teams, while they do, are maybe a little bit better secondaries, they got another guy to worry about on this Vikings team, and that's Justin Jefferson, which just opens up so much more for Addison. Plus, Naylor's playing great. Hawkins is going to come back at some point. Addison is a very good buy low right now. Even if you're just kind of waiting around the corner to end up starting him, I think now is the time to go out and trade for him while you still can. All right, first running back I'm going to talk about is Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers, a running back good enough in the first 2 weeks of the season, 12.4 and 13.1 fantasy points. Then coming off kind of a questionable fantasy performance in week 3 with just 5.8 fantasy points. Just 3.07 yards per carry, 43 yards on the ground, and one catch for 5 yards. But what made it even more wary was the fact that Emmanuel Wilson, backup running back, had 16.5 fantasy points, had a reception that went for a touchdown and had 50 yards on the ground. So now we got fantasy managers worrying about Emmanuel Wilson, who, by the way, I talked about last Saturday's video for a last-minute waiver ad as a great handcuff stash. But nonetheless, Jacobs going to be fine, okay? Maybe not this week against the Vikings. Once again, I mean, similar to Jaden Reed, this is a tough matchup against the Vikings, which might help you get a deal done with a player like Josh Jacobs coming off of a bad performance. But he's going to get the Rams, the Cardinals, a good game script at least against the Texans, and the Jaguars, a good game script against the Lions. And when we do see Jordan Love come back, this offense as a whole is just going to be more efficient. It's going to lead overall for Josh Jacobs to have more efficient days. And, we saw what type of volume he can get in week 2 with 32 total touches. We've seen solid fantasy performances out of him on the season. Maybe the ceiling's not crazy high, but it's hard to kind of evaluate that ceiling when Jordan Love, their starting quarterback, hasn't been healthy. So still averaging double-digit fantasy points per game on the season. A very cheap running back to go out and trade for right now, who I still think is going to be solid on the season. Go out and buy Josh Jacobs low right now before Jordan Love is back and this Packers offense completely changes. Next running back I want to talk about is James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. He gets the Washington Commanders in week 4, coming off a bad game against the Lions in week 3 with just 3.5 fantasy points and just 1.89 yards per carry. But this Lions run defense right now is playing as the best run defense in the whole NFL. We can expect a bad performance out of a player like James Conner against a run defense like the Lions, but he had 19.3, fantasy points in week 1, 19.4 in week 2, and he should pop again against the Commanders at home in week 4. Gets a good matchup against the Niners. Can't believe I'm saying that, but the Niners defense has been very weak. Then they'll get the Packers and the Chargers in the next coming weeks, so still at least good game scripts in the next few weeks. But overall, Conner was really reminding us the first 2 weeks of the season why he's always a great draft selection late in drafts. He's still a top 16 fantasy running back right now, still averaging 14.1 fantasy points per game. So use this bad performance against the Lions, once again, the best run defense in the NFL right now, as an excuse to go out and buy him low, because he's going to get right back to action in week 4 against the Commanders. They've been a poor run defense, a poor defense as a whole, awful secondary so far on the season. That's not going to change on the road against the Cardinals here in week 4. Conner's due for a big day Sunday. Go out and buy him low while you still can. All right, next up is Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. And I don't think we need to break this one down too extensively. We all know what Devon Achane brings to the table. He's still averaging 20.4 fantasy points per game, right? 23 in week 1, 29.5 in week 2. Then in week 3, this was just a bad spot. Skylar Thompson comes out as starting quarterback. He gets hurt. Tim Boyle gets put in there. This Seattle defense is playing well overall on the season, but Achane's still the RB12 right now, and I think you just got to look at things. Great matchup against Tennessee this week. Maybe Tyler Huntley starts at quarterback and gives his team some life, but Tua can still come back this year. That might end up being the plan after he, sits out these, next 3 games. They have the week 6 bye as well. So I don't know if that puts Tua, potentially coming back in week 7 or week 8. But if Tua wants to play, he can still come back this year, and that will solve a lot of these offensive problems for the Dolphins. But I think you just have to look at things either way. Players like Devon Achane are still going to get fed the football, especially when their offenses aren't playing at a peak level. You look at a guy like Breece Hall last year, who still finished as a top 5 fantasy running back with quarterbacks like Zach Wilson, and I can't even remember half the quarterbacks that ended up starting with Breece Hall last year. But sometimes a running back who catches the football benefits even more because they get dump-offs from these backup quarterbacks. So Achane, you got everything in line to buy Achane low right now, coming off of an 8.8 performance. Big question mark at quarterback. Big question marks around this offense. Devon Achane is a great buy low moving into week 4. All right, last running back I'm going to mention is Brian Robinson Jr. of the Washington Commanders. He'll play the Arizona Cardinals defense this week. This run defense has been very poor for the Cardinals, but more importantly, Brian Robinson Jr. solid in week 1, 17.9 points, solid in week 2, 14.6. Not as good in week 3 at 10.7, 1 touchdown on the day, 2.06 yards per carry. And we saw Austin Eckler score in week 3, but Eckler's out week 4 with the concussion. Brian Robinson's still been very good on the season, the RB15 so far, 14.4 fantasy points per game. And he should pop again in week 4 against this Cardinals defense without Austin Eckler taking any touches. I know that we also have Jeremy McNichols on this team, but Brian Robinson Jr. is in line for a big week 4. And I don't really know how many opportunities you're going to get to buy him low. Like, I think he's just going to keep ripping off double-digit fantasy performances week after week. But this was a lower one at 10.7 fantasy points. So buy him coming off of this performance because I think he's just going to keep being consistent week in and week out. An RB2 that you can trust on your roster, a guy that you can throw in at the flex if you have nothing there. We've had so many injuries this season that it could be a very real possibility for you. Buy him low before he pops off again in week 4. All right, very quickly, let's take a look at one tight end and one quarterback. Let's start with David Njoku. Still questionable for week 4 at the time I'm recording this, dealing with that ankle injury he suffered in week 1. And last week's video where I encourage you guys to go out and trade for Jake Ferguson, buy him low before he played again in week 3 and reminded people like he's just not an injured tight end on your roster. He's going to be a viable fantasy starter all season long. And that's how I feel about David Njoku right now. If he doesn't play in week 4 against the Raiders, which is a great matchup, he gets the Commanders in week 5, which is a great matchup. And you kind of look for the next couple of weeks for the Browns, the Raiders, the Commanders, the Eagles, the Bengals, the Ravens. 5 really solid weeks in terms of opposing defenses. David Njoku still had 8.4 fantasy points in week 1 off of 4 receptions before he got hurt. Right now, for the tight end position in fantasy football, that's actually pretty dang good for a floor because of how bad the position's been all season long. But this was the tight end 6 last year, the tight end 10 in 2022. And this is similar to the Jake Ferguson situation. You just want to go buy him low because he's clogging a roster spot on the bench for someone. They want to get rid of him. They don't want to think about it. And they have maybe forgotten about the fact that David Njoku is still a very solid, viable tight end option on a weekly basis. Someone you can sit and just forget. So go buy David Njoku before he potentially plays again in week 4. All right, let's talk about a quarterback. I thought a lot about this one, and I went with my guy, Anthony Richardson. Listen, bad in week 3. Bad in week 2. 5 interceptions between those 2 games. I get it. It makes you feel a little queasy. But if you drafted Anthony Richardson, you might also be feeling a little bit queasy. And that's what we want to try and target here is your league mate who drafted Anthony Richardson because the ceiling is still 27 fantasy points on the season so far. So what we want to look at as well is he's playing the Steelers in week 4. They are allowing the fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. So we've got him coming off of 2 bad games, a very bad, literally the worst possible matchup in week 4. I think you can buy Anthony Richardson pretty low, and I've already seen some of you guys have trade questions that involve Anthony Richardson where fantasy managers are ready to forget about him completely. But let's look ahead here. I mean, he gets the Jaguars, the Titans, the Dolphins, the Texans again, Minnesota, Buffalo, Jets. I mean, that's a tough stretch, but at least good competitive game scripts. Then he gets the Lions, the Patriots, a late bye in week 14. Then the fantasy playoffs, the Broncos, the Titans, the Giants. I think he could be very valuable in the fantasy playoffs, but also really valuable in those kind of early weeks, Jaguars, Titans, Dolphins, Texans for the second time. And even if he struggles against teams like Minnesota, Buffalo, and the Jets potentially, like I said, good competitive game scripts there as well. But what we really want to look at is down the stretch there in the fantasy playoffs. Broncos, Titans, Giants. I feel pretty good about Anthony Richardson in those matchups. So it's been bad the last 2 weeks, but the last 2 weeks don't tell the whole story of the fantasy season for Anthony Richardson. We know the upside that he brings to the table. The passing attack has been tough. I get it. There's a lot of question marks here. There's a lot of worry. But this is still a player who can make a lot of plays with his legs and is still going to bring upside from a fantasy football perspective. And even if Richardson's only a guy we kind of start based on matchups, that's okay because right now, coming off these 2 games, going against the Steelers this week, I think you can buy Anthony Richardson incredibly low. So do it while you still can. And that'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything heading into week 4, of 2024 fantasy football. Let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Don't forget, we have everything live on the channel that you guys need for week 4 of the season. Start sits at every single position. Running backs and wide receivers you can't afford to bench this week. Must start kickers, must start defenses, an early waiver wire video. And tomorrow we'll have our last minute waiver wire video going out first thing Saturday morning. And on top of that, fantasy Q&A live streams all throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.